100 years. That was not a slogan. That was a specification, written into contracts, funded by 45 nations, signed off by engineers who understood exactly what they were being asked to contain. The structure, built over the ruins of Chernobyl's fourth reactor, was designed to stand for a century. It is 108 meters tall. It spans 257 meters. Fully equipped, it weighs 36,000 tons, and it remains the largest movable land-based structure ever built by human hands. 9 years after it was moved into place, a drone breached its roof. Nobody was killed. Nobody was injured. Radiation levels outside the arch did not rise, and for about 72 hours, that was the entire story. Then, months later, the International Atomic Energy Agency, an organization that chooses its words with extraordinary care, because every sentence it publishes moves governments, reached a conclusion in language it does not use casually. It said the structure had lost its primary safety functions, including confinement. Confinement. That was the job that made every other job possible. Before we go further, I want to hand you 3 numbers. Just 3. 100, 9, 4. 100 you already have. The design life. 9 you already have. What it delivered before it was breached. 4 is the one I haven't explained yet. 4 is the reason this is not a story about the past. Hold on to those 3. By the end of this video, they will mean something completely different than they do right now. Here is what happened that night. At approximately 1:50 in the morning on the 14th of February 2025, staff and international monitors at the Chernobyl site heard an explosion. A Shahed-type drone, identified by Ukrainian authorities as a Russian Jiran-2, an attribution Moscow has denied, had struck the arch. It punched a hole roughly 15 square meters across. It destroyed the structure's hermetic seal and damaged its ventilation system. The fire it started burned inside the cladding for about 2 weeks. Components of the main crane system were damaged. A weapon costing a tiny fraction of what the structure cost had gone through it in a single night. But the monitors outside stayed where they were supposed to stay. There was no cloud, no siren, no evacuation. And the world moved on within 3 days. The people whose job is to think in decades did not move on, because what the drone destroyed was not radiation shielding. It was the mechanism that was supposed to make the next 50 years survivable. One quick thing before we get to what is actually underneath that arch. Of those 3 numbers, 100, 9, 4, one of them is the one that changes the meaning of this entire story, and it is probably not the one you would expect. Put your guess in the comments, and I will tell you at the end which one I mean and why. And if you want to see how this ends, full restoration is currently targeted for 2030. This story is going to change again, more than once. Subscribe, and I will be here when it does. To understand what was broken, you have to understand what was built. Go back to 1986. On the 26th of April, during a safety test that went catastrophically wrong, Reactor number 4 exploded. The blast lifted the upper biological shield, a concrete lid weighing roughly 2,000 tons, off its seat. It did not land flat. It came to rest at an angle, wedged, like a coin dropped between 2 floorboards. It is still sitting there today. Nobody has ever moved it. The fuel inside did not stay fuel. It melted, and as it melted, it mixed with sand, with concrete, with steel, with everything that was dropped into the hole from helicopters trying to smother it. What flowed out was a man-made lava-like mass of fuel and building material. Engineers call it corium. It ran down through the corridors and stairwells beneath the reactor and hardened where it stopped. The most famous formation of it, sitting in a steam distribution corridor, was named for what it resembled: an elephant's foot. When it was first found, standing near it for a few minutes was enough to be fatal. It has cooled substantially since. It has not become safe. And around all of it, the Soviet Union built a box. They called it the shelter object. Everyone else called it the sarcophagus. Hundreds of thousands of people took part in the wider cleanup, many in conditions that would be unthinkable today. Some of the teams sent onto the most contaminated rooftops worked in shifts measured in seconds. One man out, one task, one man back, and then the next. They poured concrete and welded steel over an active, burning ruin, while it was still burning, because there was no other option available to them. They finished it in months, and here is what tends to get forgotten about the sarcophagus. It was never built to last. It was an emergency measure, assembled at speed under lethal conditions by people who could not perform normal engineering surveys, because standing where the surveys needed to happen would kill you. Parts of it rest on the damaged walls of the original reactor building, walls that had just been through an explosion and whose true condition has never been fully verified. Rainwater got in through the cracks, humidity built up inside, steel corroded in the dark for decades in a space no human being could enter and inspect. By the mid-1990s, formal assessments were already warning that the roof could come down. So the world decided to build a second box around the first box. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development managed a 20-year international effort, gathering funding from 45 countries. And the arch was not built over the reactor. It could not be. You cannot ask construction crews to spend years standing directly above the most contaminated structure on the planet. So, they built it more than 300 meters away on cleaner ground, in two halves, lifted and joined. Then, in 2016, they slid the finished 36,000-ton arch along rails over the sarcophagus and set it down. It cost around €1.5 billion. The wider cleanup program it belongs to has cost more than $2 billion. And here is what almost gets lost in the engineering. The new safe confinement was never meant to be the answer. It was meant to be the workshop. Inside it, hanging from its roof, is a system of remote cranes and robotic manipulators. The plan was never to cover the sarcophagus and walk away for a century. The plan was to use those machines, operated remotely with human beings, safely outside, to take the sarcophagus apart piece by piece and finally deal with what is inside it. The arch was the tool that made dismantling possible. The 100-year design life was not a promise that it would hold forever. It was a budget of time in which to finish the job. Which brings us back to the 14th of February. The drone did not hit a wall. It hit the roof, and the roof is what the cranes hang from. There is a second problem, almost cruel in its geometry. The hole cannot simply be patched because of where it sits, directly above the sarcophagus. To repair it properly, workers and equipment have to operate in the narrow space between the two shells, above a crumbling structure containing everything I have just described, inside an enclosure that no longer seals, in a country at war. And the arch does not confine by being solid. It confines by managing air, ventilation, and controlled pressure differentials, keeping contaminated dust from drifting outward. That requires power. And in January of 2026, after military activity destabilized Ukraine's electrical grid, the site lost all of its off-site power. The IAEA recorded it running on emergency diesel generators for approximately 1 hour. So here is where things actually stand. The IAEA's assessment is that the new safe confinement has lost its primary safety functions, including confinement. Its load-bearing stability remains intact. The arch is not falling down, and I want to be precise about that rather than dramatic. Temporary repairs closed the hole in the outer cladding before winter, enough to keep the weather out. That fix was explicitly described by the plant's Director General as temporary. Full restoration is now targeted for 2030. The active phase of that work is not expected to begin until early 2028. A preliminary technical assessment by the two French contractors who built the arch puts the cost in the order of 500 million euros. The international fund supporting the work currently holds around 70 million euros. 30 million of that has been allocated to engineering, investigations, and preparation, not to the repair itself. The full construction budget has not yet been secured. And in April of 2026, ahead of the 40th anniversary of the disaster, a report was published by Eric Schmeemann, an engineer who spent years at Chernobyl working on the design and construction of the arch itself. Not an outside critic, one of the people who built it. His conclusion was that the damage prevents the safe dismantling of the sarcophagus using the internal cranes and robotic systems. The workshop cannot do the work, and because the sarcophagus cannot be taken apart, it goes on standing and aging and corroding. A structure assembled in a panic in 1986, warned about in the 1990s, decades past any reasonable service life. The assessment was that the risk of its collapse has increased, and now the number 4 tons. That is Greenpeace's estimate of the highly radioactive dust inside the sarcophagus, alongside fuel pellets and the remains of the core. Not removed, not packaged into engineered containers, not in a repository. Dust, sitting loose inside a structure built in an emergency 4 decades ago under a roof that no longer closes properly. If that inner shell were to fail in an uncontrolled way, the outer shell, the one designed to catch precisely that event, is currently not performing the function it was built for. That is the whole story. That is why a hole that released no radiation, injured nobody, and vanished from the news in 3 days is treated as one of the most consequential setbacks to Chernobyl's long-term safety in decades. Because it was never about the hole. It was about the clock. So, 3 numbers: 100, 9, 4. Most people would pick 4. 4 tons of radioactive dust sounds like the frightening one, and it is certainly the most vivid. For me, it is not 4, because 100 was a plan, and 4 is a fact that has been sitting there since 1986, that everybody knew about, and that the arch was specifically built to handle. Those 2 numbers were accounted for. Those 2 numbers were in the design. 9 was in nobody's design. 9 is the distance between what we said we would do and what we actually managed. We looked at the worst industrial accident in history. We spent 30 years and more than €1 billion building the most sophisticated containment structure ever attempted. We told ourselves we had bought a century of breathing room to finally clean it up properly. And we got 9 years before something cheap and disposable went through the roof. Every other place I have taken you on this channel was a door we opened. The deepest borehole ever drilled. A lake sealed under ice for 15 million years. A cave untouched for 5.5 million. Every one of them, we broke the seal because we wanted to see. Chernobyl is the only door we ever closed because we were afraid of what was behind it. It is the one door we swore we would keep shut. And now the seal is broken. Tell me in the comments whether you picked 9 and whether you think 2030 is a realistic date, or whether that number is going to end up on a list like this one someday too.